Good evening. Welcome to our program, Your Health in a Changing Climate. I am Stephanie Pearson, Chair of the Environmental Issues Committee of the League of Women Voters of Broward County. The League is a 103-year-old nonpartisan organization dedicated to encouraging the informed and active participation of citizens in government. Although we do not support any candidate or party, we do advocate for issues that we have studied and host informational programs like this one. And by the way, League membership is open to men and women, so we welcome you to join us. Our Environmental Issues Committee has hosted programs on various topics, including coral reefs, water, and nuclear energy. Locally, we follow and advocate for responsible waste management and the protection of our public parks from inappropriate private projects. We provide speakers to the community on environmental topics. For up-to-date information on our events and recordings of previous programs, please visit our website, lwvbroward.org. We're happy to host this conversation about public health issues arising from climate change and how we can best manage the risks. Climate change has been discussed widely in the public for at least 30 years, and now more people are seeing and acknowledging the effects. We talk about resilience and the protection of property and infrastructure, but it is time now to talk more about the public health impacts and what we can do. There is not only a concern for human health, which we will discuss, but also for our economy. The price tag for not addressing the growing health issues now will only increase over time. To save lives and protect our health, let's identify the public health issues associated with climate change and plan to mitigate the effects. To persuade our public officials to address climate change, environmental arguments alone don't always move the needle, but discussing the public health impacts and the subsequent economic fallout might just help get more elected officials on board with the importance of mitigating climate change and supporting public health protections. We are fortunate to have two physicians with us today who are also public health activists, Dr. Julie Long and Dr. Georgia Christakis. Dr. Georgia Christakis is a pediatrician, public health worker, and mom living in Boca Raton, Florida. She studied at Florida State University's College of Medicine and completed her residency in pediatrics in New York, followed by a global health fellowship and a master's in public health at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She was born and raised in Florida and is working to make the state a safer and healthier place for all children through education and advocacy. Dr. Julie Long is a well-respected pediatric surgeon who has practiced for over 30 years in Broward County. She graduated from the University of Florida School of Medicine, did a general surgery residency and research residency at Washington University in St. Louis, and a fellowship at Children's Hospital in Michigan. Dr. Long is a local activist for the environment and public health, and we are so fortunate to have her as an active League member. At this time, Dr. Georgia Christakis will give her presentation, followed by Dr. Julie Long, and thank you so much both for being here.
All right, thanks so much for having me. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now. And bear with us on any technological hiccups. So I titled my talk, Think Global, Act Local, because climate change is something that affects all of us. And in order to combat it, we really do have to act on every level. And so I want to talk a little bit today about two of the kind of 8 realms of climate change and how they're impacted, how we can protect ourselves as individuals, and what we can do to improve the longevity and the health of our community. I have nothing financial to disclose, but I do want to thank both my partner here, Dr. Julie Long, Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, who I've been a member of for about a year since I moved down here from the Northeast. Also the School of Public Health, where I got a ton of really amazing education, and Cambridge Health Alliance, which sponsors a climate health organizing fellowship for clinicians across the country. Briefly, we'll talk about, just what climate change is, what it means, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis, how it impacts health, and we'll focus in on heat and vector-borne diseases and how some of these issues affect vulnerable populations in our area, and what we can do finally to combat climate change in our part of Florida and do our part, as citizens. So I wanted to start off briefly with this map, and I'll kind of give a little pause at home so that anyone watching at home can take a second to guess. But if anyone wants to throw out an idea of where this area might be, I'll give you a few seconds and then I'll let you know. So this is a primarily Black neighborhood in Miami that was a thriving area. It was called the Harlem of the South in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s, just a piece of history, there was a federal act to build and expand upon the highways reaching across the United States, both north and south and east and west. And so as you can see, by 1980, this entire neighborhood was cut through by the interstate now known as I-95. So I just wanted to start out our talk like this because you can see very clearly how communities of color are disproportionately affected by environmental and climate issues. While we won't necessarily talk about redlining quite as much, and we won't necessarily talk about air pollution as much in my part of the talk, I just wanted to highlight this as a historical issue in our area that continues to impact residents in this region today who have higher incidence of respiratory illnesses and problems related to the air pollution caused by I-95 cutting through their neighborhood. And then I just wanted to bring it home a little bit to give a sense of where we started and where we were maybe 10, 15 years ago and where we are now. So this is a map of Florida published by the CDC. And you can see it's from 2007. And what we're looking at is the annual number of extreme heat days from May to September. Some people are starting to call this heat season. As you can see, there's kind of some areas that are looking pretty bad, but we also have areas that have anywhere from like 1 to 4 to 0 days of extreme heat. This is the same map in 2019. So we can see in a fairly short period, especially Broward and Miami-Dade County are experiencing over 144 days of extreme heat if you look down at the deep granular details of this map. So in just a short time frame, we've had expanding problems with heat in our part of the United States, and it's something that's going to be impacting us now, and it's going to continue, into the future, and something that we all, as citizens need to be aware of. Now, honing in a little bit closer, so this is again Broward County, and we can see that as we go from east to west, you have a little bit of cooling from the coast. This is to take a step backwards, a heat vulnerability data explorer. And this particular map shows us the number of days that we had above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in May to September. And you can see again, those areas on the East Coast, which get a little bit of, more exposure to the coast, don't have quite as many hot days. But as we move further west into wildlife management areas and maybe some farmlands as well in the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation, we have well over 144 days of extreme heat per year, which is, ends up being almost half of the year in extreme heat. So how does this impact our health? So obviously it doesn't feel very nice when things are hot, but let's get a little bit into the science. Let's see if we can quickly play this. This is a very short visual about what is happening to our planet. So solar radiation gets absorbed by the Earth and then gets radiated back into space. This is a very kind of normal process, but some of this infrared radiation gets trapped in the Earth's atmosphere and warms it. And as we have been increasing our CO2 emissions and our activity and production of other greenhouse gases, man-made contributions to climate change have led to our planet becoming warmer over time. This is something that's been well documented in the data, and it contributes to climate change in a number of ways. We think about warmer temperatures, but also longer, wetter seasons in some areas, whereas some areas may be deprived of water and have extreme dry seasons. We see rising water levels and flooding issues like what we saw just a couple of weeks ago at the Fort Lauderdale airport. And we'll get into just a couple of these issues in a moment. Just one way that heat-related health outcomes are being tracked in Florida is hospitalizations. So over time, you can see that this is a graph looking from 2005 to 2018 at heat-related hospitalizations in Florida. And we've seen a very distinct rise in these hospitalizations across the state. So climate change impacts human health in a number of ways. I think people think a lot about extreme heat because that's something very tangible, especially down here in Florida, and how that contributes to heat-related illness and death. But there's really kind of 8 regions that the CDC identifies as, target areas that climate change impacts human health. Severe weather, like we see in our hurricanes, leads to injuries, fatalities, mental health impacts. Air pollution contributes to rising rates of asthma and cardiovascular disease. Something else we will talk about in a little bit is how changes in vector ecology and expanded range of the mosquitoes and the ticks and other insects that transmit infectious diseases is going to cause more infectious diseases in a broader range of the planet. Increasing allergens. So as we have rising temperatures, we see longer and more intense pollen seasons, and that again contributes to rates of asthma and allergies. Water quality impacts. This is something we're definitely seeing, as we had in Palm Beach County, several beaches closed last week. So because of issues with the high bacterial levels. And water and food supply. So globally, we're going to see changes in the way that water is distributed across the planet. And we've already seen in recent years some very extreme famines leading to malnutrition and diarrheal disease. And then all of this overall environmental degradation leading to forced migration, civil conflict, and mental health impacts that will very much be impacting us all on a global level. For today's talk, I'm just going to focus in on heat-related illness and then also in changes in vector ecology, as these are 2 things that are very much affecting us here in Florida. Not to say that the others aren't important and that they're not also affecting us, but it would be a much longer talk. And as a pediatrician, I always like to kind of talk about some of the impacts of climate change on the child. So air pollutants cause rising rates of asthma and allergies in children, more frequent exacerbations, and increased mortality from lower respiratory tract infections. So think about your pneumonias and your respiratory tract diseases. In addition, extreme heat exposure in utero leads to congenital heart and neural tube defects. So when pregnant women are exposed to extreme levels of heat, this can actually impact the fetus. My colleague, Dr. Julie Long, will get into the impacts of microplastics and how they contain certain chemicals that will be present in solid organs. And our young people, especially children and young adults, are seeing increasing rates of what we call climate anxiety and depression that is related to the impacts of climate change. There's a number of other systemic illnesses that will affect children as well that will really kind of be a problem in future years. So again, going back to the Southeast and the Caribbean, we're seeing that 61% of major Southeastern cities are exhibiting worsening heat waves more than any other region. And partly this is because of how they're designed. When we don't have adequate tree coverage and adequate building materials, these cities can get extremely hot and it can be very dangerous to be in a city during a heat wave. We have seen rises in stroke and heart disease related death, and urban populations in particular are very vulnerable. And then we'll get into this again in a little bit, but vector-borne diseases. So a vector-borne disease, just to kind of break down this term a little bit, is any infectious disease that is transmitted by another animal. So one fun fact, or not so fun fact, that we sometimes talk about in infectious disease is the most deadly animal on the planet isn't anything you would expect, like a shark or a wolf or any aggressive mammal. It's the mosquito. Mosquitoes carry a ton of infectious diseases, from malaria to dengue to Zika. And in particular, in our area, the Aedes aegypti species of mosquito is going to have expanded range, not just from the Caribbean. It's going to now start to impact us here in the United States as well. And we're going to see increasing rates of dengue and Zika that are transmitted here on our soil. So who is that health is at most at risk from extreme heat? We did talk a little bit about children and the elderly, but of course, poor, displaced, and homeless and other vulnerable populations are going to be more prone to extreme heat. They have less protection. less access to air conditioning and safe cool spaces when heat emergencies come up, folks with disabilities, pregnant or ill, outdoor workers, including our farm workers, and athletes and attendees of outdoor events. Exposure to high temperatures can lead to a number of different heat-related illnesses. Some you may have heard of are heat stroke, heat exhaustion, heat syncope and cramps, and many of these can lead to death. Some of this is related to these illnesses, but we also see increases in all-cause mortality during periods of extreme heat. And while there's currently 12,000 average annual heat-related fatalities in the United States, we expect that this number may increase by up to 34,000. And these pictures just highlight two folks in South Florida, or two groups in South Florida that are going to be particularly at risk, one of which is our migrant workers who spend time in the western parts of Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade County harvesting, and do not have a lot of protections to protect them from extreme heat in terms of, laws or anything of that nature. And then also people who are spending a lot of time outside commuting. This is a bus stop in Miami that has no shade at all. So people who are just trying to get around to jobs or doctor's appointments, and don't have access to a car, especially in urban areas where there's not a lot of tree coverage or shade, are going to be quite vulnerable to this. So how do we, on an individual level, take care of ourselves and prevent heat injury? We want to make sure we're hydrating well before and during any activities. Avoid exercise or any outdoor work during the hottest times of the day, generally from 11 a.m. to 3 or 4 p.m. And of course, during periods of extreme heat, we'll see that heat waves get announced and treated like emergencies, and that's going to become a more common event during the summer. If you are spending time outdoors, take frequent breaks for hydration and cooling. Make sure you're wearing appropriate clothing that facilitates heat loss. And if you start to feel unwell, stop exercising immediately and find a cool place to rest and drink some water, or take some liquids. So typically when we're talking about heat illness, there's a number of different ways it can affect you, but the two main ones that we want folks to look out for to take care of themselves and be aware of as we go into the summer and we go into our heat season are heat exhaustion and heat stroke. And there's a kind of distinction between the two. So heat exhaustion, you might feel faint or dizzy, you may be sweating excessively, but your skin is still cool because the sweating is doing its job, which is to evaporate and then cool your skin. You might feel nausea or vomiting. You may have a rapid weak pulse if somebody, who has some BLS skills is checking on you, and you may feel muscle cramps, but you're not going to be confused. You're not going to have any altered mental status, and you're not going to have any loss of consciousness. Meanwhile, heat stroke, you're going to have a headache. You may be confused. Someone may lose consciousness. They're no longer sweating because it's become too hot for the body to use the normal pathways to cool off. And this will be shown by the body temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit or above when you present to the ER or to an emergency facility. Patients may have nausea or vomiting, and they may lose consciousness. So for somebody who is facing heat exhaustion, we want to move to a cool place right away. Take small sips of water if you can tolerate. Use a cold compress or take a cool shower. And if things really aren't resolving within an hour or symptoms worsen at all, we really need to call 911 and get that person more care. Heat stroke is a bit of a different story, especially because of the altered mental status. We want to call 911 right away. We don't give that person anything to drink, but although we do want to also move them to a cooler place. So that's just a little bit of information about how to take care of ourselves and our colleagues in our neighborhoods and as we enter heat season. But what about from a public health and policy level? So cities really need to have a plan in place for heat season. We need to ensure that vulnerable populations are included, that we have cooling centers that are accessible, that people know where to find them, that they are accessible to everybody, not just certain areas. We also want to, on a kind of long-term scale, increase tree canopy. Tree coverage can prevent heating and can mean a difference of several degrees of temperature, which really can impact the local populations. There are cooler surface materials than asphalt that cities can rebuild with. And then we also, of course, very big picture, very big scale, but incredibly important, want to reduce waste and greenhouse gas emissions through safe alternative transportation, such as electric vehicles or buses, and bicycling. We also want to weatherize and improve the efficiency in buildings. But again, it's incredibly important that all of these changes are done in an equitable way, because even as of right now, we can look at our cities and see that based on what zip code you live in and who lives there, there can be a huge difference in how the city is designed and how hot or cool it is. So moving again into vector-borne diseases, and we touched on this a little bit, so I won't go too deep, but this is as of 2019. And this is looking at the number of months per year when disease transmission by that Aedes aegypti mosquito that's responsible for dengue and Zika virus is possible. Now, worst case scenario, without any mitigation of climate change, we're going to see a much expanded vector range, which I don't know if you can see here, but Florida will definitely be a part of that, that range. So we'll see more of the mosquitoes that transmit these infectious diseases, and we'll see more of these infectious diseases. On an individual level, we can prevent these in diseases by using insecticides such as DEET and permethrin, either directly on the skin or by treating our clothing or wearing permethrin treated clothing. When we're exploring the outdoors, wearing long sleeves and pants, avoiding time outside during sunrise and sunset, as there are several species of mosquitoes that primarily are out and about and biting during those time periods. In certain areas, and we didn't talk about ticks, but we certainly will also see expanded range of ticks moving further south, and they transmit Lyme and a number of other infectious diseases. Checking for ticks after spending time in outdoor and wooded areas. And then, of course, eliminating sources of standing water in yards and areas near homes. So I wanted to touch base a little bit on some ways that we can combat climate change, again, on a higher level. So the CDC has a framework for climate and health adaptation. And if anybody here works in quality improvement, you might recognize a similar pattern here. But the goal is to build resilience against the climate effects. So assessing the vulnerabilities, looking at and projecting what the disease burden is going to be, taking a look at and tweaking our public health interventions, implementing a climate and health adaptation plan, and then turning around and evaluating what we've done and seeing how we can improve it in quality. And this is something that we all need to be a part of, not just the policymakers, not just the specialists. I think this is very much an area that I think citizens should have a voice as well. There's a lot that we can do. So Julie and I feel very passionate about educating the public about the public health harms of climate change and what we can do. And that's very much a role that the FCCA takes on. We also want to create early warning systems to help folks prepare for any climate influenced event. I think we're okay at this with hurricanes. We could be better, but we definitely need to work on this for heat related illness and heat emergencies. We need to use research to better understand the health harms and effective responses. And we need to contribute to public dialogue and talk with informed stakeholders about how climate related health harms and how those harms will be experienced locally. And I will just go ahead and take 1 minute to highlight a bill. So if you're watching this before May 6th, then Florida's legislation is still in session, and House Bill 903 and Senate Bill 706 are companion bills that are currently filed in the legislature about educating and training employers and employees on how to recognize and prevent heat-related illnesses. We would ask that you take a moment to maybe screenshot this, review the bill, and you can make calls to Florida's House Speaker Representative and the Senate President to ask them to review these bills and have these bills heard by the committee. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I'll go ahead and stop my sharing now so that Dr. Long can take over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christakis. I have one or two quick questions. You mentioned an early warning system, which of course we all know we have for hurricanes, but I've read that there also is a heat wave warning system that local governments could put out. Are you aware of any of that in South Florida right now, or is that something that you've heard about that we might try to implement down here?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a great question. I know that I was at an NOAA conference maybe about a month ago in Miami, and Miami-Dade definitely has these warning systems. But of course, the goal is always to get to the people that need it. So you can't always put it just on the Weather Channel. You want to make sure that it's on radios, that it's in both English and Spanish so that everyone can hear and everyone understands and knows what to do during those hot periods and where the cooling centers are. I can't speak to Broward and Palm Beach counties, but I know that at least Miami-Dade, they have one, and they're very good about putting it out on multiple avenues of media to make sure as many people as possible get the message.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was great. We appreciate it.
Thank you again for having me.
Julie, are you set to give your presentation?
Might want to stop recording for a minute because I have to find mine. Oh, it says it's recording us now.
Okay, Dr. Julie Long, we're anxious to hear what you have to say, so please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank the League of Women Voters for asking me to talk about this important topic. I joined the League in 2016. It was an antidote to some anxiety I was having, and I've been very happy to be involved with a group of people that are such committed to helping the society and so knowledgeable about the environment. I've learned a lot, and I want to thank particularly Monica Elliott and Stephanie Pearson for all they've taught me and for their encouragement and for allowing us to have this presentation this evening. Next. So everybody has their climate story. My story is I grew up in Florida, but I moved back to Florida in 1991. We were living in Miami. We got hit by Hurricane Andrew. Our home was destroyed. We had to rebuild it. After the hurricane, like many people, I became a climate refugee and moved up to Broward County. That was the happy part of the story. And I practiced surgery in Broward County ever since that time. But even at that time, I learned that the response to this disaster was not adequate. It's hard for any community to be ready for a storm of that magnitude, but we don't have to look back that many years. We can only look over to the West Coast and see what happened with Hurricane Ian just last fall to see what happened. So we really have to be aware of the climate. Next. My disclaimers, I'm not a basic scientist, although I did do research many years ago. I'm a practicing pediatric surgeon for 35 years. I care from children from birth to 20 years of age and have no financial disclosures. Next. Next. So when we hear news or we hear information, it's important to differentiate what are facts, what are observations, and what are opinions. Facts are what's proven by scientific research. Observations is what I've experienced over my years of practicing surgery. I've observed changes in certain diseases and problems that children were having that I didn't see at the beginning of my training. And then opinions are things that we all have. Next. So plastics is what I want to focus on this evening. We like plastic. It's very convenient. Are plastics part of climate change? And do plastics harm our health? Next. So those of us of a certain age will remember this movie, The Graduate, 1967. Mr. McGuire is talking to Ben and puts his arm around him and says, I have one thing to say to you, plastics. And then he says, the future is in plastics. Well, he was right. Next. So this graph shows cumulative CO2 emissions from 1750 to 2020. The graph is flat until the 1900s, and then it starts rising exponentially. And on the far right is we now have over 1.6 trillion tons of CO2 in our atmosphere. Next. This graph shows global temperatures since 1880. On the far right, we see that from 1981 to 2001, global temperatures, average global temperatures have risen dramatically and are continuing to rise. Next. So what does this have to do with plastics, or what do plastics have to do with this? 75% of petrochemical production is now directed towards the manufacturing of more plastic. So this is the major source of greenhouse gases. Next. This graph shows global annual plastic production. Plastics were invented before 1950. You can see there was no plastic made at that point. And in 2020, we had almost 500 million metric tons of plastic produced a year. Next. This graph shows what's happening. The good news is parts of society are adapting and recognizing that climate change is a real entity, and there have been very positive developments. It's projected that we're going to be using less energy for power, buildings, driving our trucks. But if you look on the far right, the global oil demand forecast in the future, the majority of it is going to be for plastic production. Next. Climate change is a medical emergency. We learned that from Dr. Christakis, but there's plastics, I would submit, is contributing to this problem. Next. Now, I'd like everybody to think back to when you were a kid growing up. How many kids had asthma? How many kids had ADHD? How many kids were on the spectrum of neurodevelopmental disorders? What was the average age of puberty? And how many couples did you know who could not have children? And then think about the present. And I think for most people, they're going to see there's been a dramatic increase. This is certainly what I saw in my years practicing surgery. Next. The known harmful chemicals in plastics are listed here. And while dioxin was taken out of pesticides, it's still in plastics, and it's emitted when plastics are incinerated. And it's a potent carcinogen, particularly associated with breast cancer. Next. This just is an article that says atmospheric micro nanoplastics are a future growing concern for human health. This was published in 2023. Next. So when you talk about plastic, size matters. Big plastic is what we see on the side of the road. The plastic bags, the bottles that get randomly discarded. Microplastic is plastic under 5 millimeters, about 1/4 of an inch. Nanoplastics we can't see, but they're there. They're everywhere. Next. So where do micro and nanoplastics come from, and where do they go? Well, they come from all these different sources: plastic bags, resins and paint, latex paint, major cause, varnish, polyvinyl alcohol, all of these substances. Where do they go? They go, if our waste is disposed of properly, it goes into the recycling or our trash. If it's not disposed of properly, it goes down into our waterways. Next. And this basically shows the cycle. If it's incinerated, it goes up in smoke, and there's byproducts. It can go into the water. The microplastics get aerosolized, and they go up into the air. And the nanoplastics are particularly problematic. Next. So on the left-hand side, you see some of the causes. Where do we get plastics? Our clothing, our skincare products, plastic bags, our food. We get it through inhalation. The nanoplastics we can inhale. We eat it. When we consume food, fish, meat, other food that has plastic in it, or in the way that our food is prepared, on the containers that our food is contained in, get coated in plastics. Plastic can go through our skin. The other way plastics can get into our body is through our bloodstream. Plastic has been found in placentas, so it's passed from the mother to the fetus in utero. Next. So what about cancer? On the left-hand side, the cancer that's increasing in incidence are listed. Now, medical science is doing a great job. Many cancers have become treatable, curable. but the incidence of new cases rising or increasing: breast, prostate, lung, thyroid, endometrial cancer, GI cancer. And of particular note, there's a dramatic increase in the incidence of new cancers in people under 50, which is very concerning, to the point that now they're recommending routine colon cancer screening at the age of 40 rather than 50. Cervical cancer is decreasing, and that's due to public health measures and screening. The cancers increasing, breast, prostate, and endometrial, are all influenced by neuroendocrine disruptors. Next. So what are neuroendocrine disruptors? They are chemicals in the environment that are perceived of as hormones. Structurally, they're similar to hormones when they're taken up by fish, aquatic animals, people. They are seen in organisms as hormones. Low-dose fetal exposure of bisphenol A affects the development of the prostate, the mammary gland. It decreases fertility. It promotes cancer development. It induces behavioral changes and promotes obesity and metabolic syndrome. All of this is probably the most important slide in my talk. All of this work is, many people have contributed to this knowledge, but Dr. Anna Soto is a pediatric endocrinologist at Tufts University. She spent 30 years doing basic science research on neuroendocrine disruptors. She's been celebrated by the NIH for research in this field. And this is established science now, to the point that we're never going to really be able to do any controlled studies of the effects of plastic in the human body for several reasons. One, it's already in our body, so there's no control group that hasn't been exposed. And the basic science research in animals is such that those studies could not be done. They wouldn't be allowed because they would be unethical to expose people to even more plastic than we're already exposed to. But that's what's happening to us every day in our society. Next. So bisphenol A is used in the synthesis of polycarbonates. Polycarbonates are used to make plastic products such as baby bottles, water bottles, and they release chemicals into that are neuroendocrine disruptors. They're estrogen mimickers, and so they affect our bodies. Next. Next. So environmental estrogen, as I said, is everywhere. Bisphenol A. Plastic, when it's heated, releases bisphenol A. So we think, okay, well, we're not heating the liquid in our plastic bottles. But think again, we live in Florida. All that plastic liquid in plastic bottles has been stored at a warehouse somewhere, and it's probably been heated. So it's already, those chemicals have already been released into that water. So the idea that drinking water out of plastic bottles is safer is really a false hope. Next. So the other thing that environmental estrogens do, they don't just affect women, they affect men. Worldwide, there's, for the last 20 years, they've noticed decreasing sperm counts, increase in incidence of testicular cancer. This is worldwide. There's been an increasing incidence of birth defects. I've seen that in my own practice. What we're seeing is more cases where it's in little boys, their penis is smaller, their testicles are smaller, or they have a condition called hypospadias. These are the results of feminizing effects in utero. Next. And precocious puberty is puberty defined as before the normal time, earlier than expected. About 20 years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics downward adjusted the normal age of puberty because so many girls were developing puberty earlier than what was thought to be normal. This slide shows the changes from 1997 to 2010, not that long a period. You can see that the incidence is doubled for whites. It's higher for blacks. In 1997, there was no data on Hispanics. And I think this shows the problem, and it also highlights that the effects of environmental pollution don't affect us all equally. Next. So there's some hopeful news in this talk. Formosa was a plastic plant that was going to be built in St. James Parish, Louisiana. Now, St. James Parish, Louisiana, to environmentalists, is well known as Cancer Alley. It's been investigated by the EPA. There's the highest incidence of cancer in the country is in that area. The citizens rose up and they kept the Formosa plastic plant from being built in their county because of the effects on air pollution and water. Next. Which population is at the greatest risk for phthalate exposure? Children under the age of 3. They put everything in their mouth. They explore the world with their mouth. Next. Unfortunately, even our hospitals are not safe. This is makes me very sad to say this. We're doing such a wonderful job taking care of premature infants and increasing their life expectancy and survival, but the very life-sustaining equipment that's used to take care of these children has polyvinyl chloride in them, which the oxygen tubing, the IV tubing, the IV bags, the tubing that delivers oxygen, it's not just in the NICU, it's throughout our hospitals, but it's the infants are the most vulnerable to this. Europe is doing, in England, they have started to rid their hospitals of this. This is something that's expensive and takes time, and it takes advocacy. Next. So how do we know what contains phthalates? The number 3 on the recycling symbol. And I have to say that these recycling triangles are really misleading to the public. You see that and you think, oh, good, I can recycle this. A lot of plastic is not recycled. A lot of it has no commercial value, and things with number 3 contain phthalates. So try to keep that away from your children. Next. Now, PFAS chemicals have been in the news, and they are a group of synthetic chemicals used since the 1940s. They're used in water repelling products, flame retardant things. Think those flame retardant pajamas that are now sold for children. PFAS is present in the water, soil, air, food. It's been found, unfortunately, in polar bears. So it is throughout our planet. Next. PFAS chemicals are called forever chemicals because they stay in the environment for so long. So what can we do about this? How can we reduce our exposure to these chemicals? Next. So certain foods like fish and shellfish raised in contaminated water contain PFAS, wild game, food packaging, pizza boxes, popcorn bags, fast food containers, anything that's coated with a slick surface, that is PFAS. It's used for convenience to prevent sticking and leakage. Water supplies, unfortunately, it's in our water, contaminated soil, nonstick cookware. Next. This is a press release from March of this year stating that for the first time, the federal government will require utilities to remove 2 PFAS chemicals, perfluoroalkyl and perfluoroalkyl chemicals, from our water supply. They're stating they should be down to near 0 levels. This has not been enacted yet. Hopefully will happen in the next few months, but the EPA has recognized the toxicity of these chemicals and is working to get them out of our water supply. Next. I mentioned that plastics are in our bodies. It's very difficult to identify plastic in the human body. It's been found in the feces of babies. Now they found it in our lungs. Well, that is from airborne plastic. And if you think about airborne plastic, we're breathing in, we can't see. And it's not just the harm of the plastic itself, but the plastic can carry viruses, they can carry bacteria, they can carry other toxic chemicals directly to our lungs. So the fact that these nanoplastics are in all over our planet is a major concern. Next. Now, does recycling solve the plastic problem? No, unfortunately. You can see from this slide, the majority of plastic ends up in landfill, litter, or the ocean. Some is incinerated, a very small percentage is recycled, 7 to 9%. Some gets reused, but the bulk of it is filling up our waterways. Next. Actions that we can take, individual actions is to become aware, become educated, speak to people about it, speak out, limit exposures. It's not just the 3 R's. The first R is refuse plastic products. Say, no thanks, I don't need that bag. And say it out loud, and your actions hopefully will influence other people to change their behavior. Community actions, support green products and businesses, speak up, and of course, vote. And next. These are some organizations that are working to reduce plastic in our environment. They're doing good work. They need all the support they can get. I hope that you will join us in this initiative. Next. Other actions we can take is say no to plastic bags. The recent flooding that we experienced in Broward County, all that plastic on the side of the road washed down the gutters. It's not just going into our waterway, it's plugging our drainage system, so we have an increased chance of flooding. So every piece of plastic that you pick up is a piece of plastic that a marine animal or a person doesn't have to eat or breathe. Bring a plastic container for home for your restaurant leftovers. Don't use the pods for laundry or dishwasher. That plastic is not biodegradable. It goes into the water system. There's good alternatives to plastic wrap. Make your own cleaning supplies, or at least buy the biggest plastic container you can to reduce your consumption. And again, pick up plastic litter. This is a huge one, and we can all do it. And it increases community involvement. Next. These are more actions that individuals can take. Next. So this was just, let's go back one. This was just a New York Times opinion piece written by Mark O'Connell, and he stated it so well. He said the whole subject of microplastics is possessed of a nightmarish lucidity because we understand it to be a symptom of a deeper disease, the unthinkable harm we have done to the planet. This is done to the planet on our behalf as consumers, is being visited in this surreal and lurid manner on our own bodies. And I would say on our children's bodies and our unborn children's bodies. When we look at the decomposing bodies of those trash-filled birds, we know that we are looking not at just what we're doing to the world, but also at what our damaged world is doing to us. Next. And this was from a quote from the Dalai Lama. It says, ultimately, the decision to save the environment must come from the human heart. The key point is a call for genuine sense of universal responsibility that is based on love, compassion, and clear awareness. Next. I hope that this has raised some questions and thoughts in your mind, and this talk will, I thank you so much for the privilege of speaking this evening.
Well, we can't thank you enough for that incredible presentation. It really is thought-provoking. I can't help but think about my nieces who have young children now, and watching them take a plastic bag of milk and warming it in, in water, hot water, and worrying about it. And I'm just wondering, what to suggest to them, if anything, that they can do with their babies, to help them and to impress it. Well, first of all, I want to impress upon them the danger of what they're doing. But second of all, what are the options? I mean, glass baby bottles, or just being careful not to warm these things up. And
Well, at least don't warm any food in plastic containers.
Right.
That's at least. And basically don't use plastic. It would be my answer. Now, I understand that plastic is very convenient. That's why it's all over our world. But those of us that are a certain age grew up when plastic was invented. I mean, I remember those Tupperware parties. People didn't have plastic, and we lived, and people lived, they ate, they raised their children. And so I think we have to say, we have to value what we value. We have to value our children's life and our health, and our unborn children, and our neighbors' children, and children we don't even know. I mean, we have to care about that. And it's very hard to tell an individual to change their behavior. I think, sometimes that with family members can raise conflict.
well, I try. We all try. All of us who are concerned about these things. I think this was excellent. I really appreciate you. We all appreciate you both preparing these presentations and doing this recording. And I hope that whoever watches this will, obviously they'll be more educated. And I also hope that they will become more activists themselves in their own lives, and maybe in their community, and work to help protect the health of everyone.
I think it doesn't take much. There's a tipping point when people start to realize there's a problem. And, after the flooding, I was walking up my street with a plastic bag, picking up trash. Somebody in a car stopped and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm picking up the plastic that's left that didn't go down the gutter and plug the drains." And she looked at me, and then she said, "I never thought about that. I'm going to do that." I mean, I was really happy about that.
We all have to speak up. I think that's the answer. You can't just say.
When I go grocery shopping, I say, "No, thank you. You don't have to put this in a plastic bag. I've got my bags. You don't have to put a plastic bag inside my bags." And they look at me kind of funny. I said, "There's too much plastic around." And that, I leave it at that. If somebody wants to talk to me about it.
Public health danger is something that I think we should all be really focusing on, because as I said in the beginning, I think that making this point is one way to get more of our elected officials in particular more aware and more interested in tackling climate issues. When you start talking about public health and the economic impacts of all this as well, and there's a million questions that we could go on, and we don't have time tonight to do that, but hopefully we'll have a chance to speak more about it. So I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you.
Thank you very much.